They don't leave claw marks like bears, they don't howl like wolves, and they don't run on four legs. Whatever's behind the torn doors, crushed fences, and vanishing people, it walks upright, leaves no trace, and disappears before anyone can get a second look. From family dogs yanked into the woods to people who vanish without warning, these are the kinds of encounters that leave behind more questions than answers. In this video, we'll explore 6 disappearances and confrontations that defy explanation, and the patterns that suggest something more than just nature is at work. Douglas Pass stretched across the rugged terrain near Rangeley, Colorado, where the Uinta Mountains met the Colorado Plateau in a maze of dense pine forests and abandoned mining trails. The area had earned a reputation among locals for its isolation, with decommissioned ranger stations dotting the landscape like forgotten sentinels. Wildlife thrived in the untouched wilderness, from elk herds to the occasional mountain lion, though something else seemed to roam these woods, according to whispered stories passed down through generations of hunters and hikers. In March 2024, Brian Jernigan, his wife Shanda, and their 11-year-old son Nathan arrived at a weathered hunting cabin borrowed from Brian's colleague. The structure sat precariously on the edge of what once served as a ranger trail, now overgrown with brambles and pine saplings. Brian had promised his family a peaceful spring break away from their hectic Denver lifestyle, complete with hiking, fishing, and campfire stories under the Colorado stars. The cabin itself told stories of decades past, with its log walls bearing the scars of harsh winters and wildlife encounters. Previous occupants had left behind hunting magazines from the 1980s and a guest book filled with tales of successful deer hunts and close calls with bears. The surrounding forest pressed in from all sides, creating an atmosphere of beautiful isolation that both excited and unsettled the family. Their first 2 days passed without incident. Nathan explored the nearby creek while Brian attempted to fix the cabin's temperamental wood stove. Shanda documented their adventure with photographs, capturing moments of her son's wonder at discovering animal tracks in the mud and Brian's frustrated battles with rusty cabin fixtures. Their golden retriever, Pepper, bounded through the forest with endless enthusiasm, chasing squirrels and investigating every interesting scent the wilderness offered. March 15th began like any other day of their vacation. Brian spent the morning teaching Nathan to identify different tree species, while Shanda prepared lunch on the cabin's ancient gas burner. Pepper maintained her usual patrol of the property perimeter, occasionally barking at distant sounds that only she could detect. The family attributed her vigilance to the abundance of wildlife in the area, from chipmunks to the deer that frequently wandered through their temporary front yard. As evening approached, the temperature dropped significantly, and Brian began preparing firewood for what promised to be a cold night. Nathan helped stack logs while Shanda called Pepper inside for dinner. The dog had been unusually restless throughout the afternoon, pacing between the cabin and the forest edge with an anxiety that seemed out of character for their normally calm pet. Just after sunset, while the family settled in for their evening meal, Pepper began barking with an intensity they had never witnessed before. The sound echoed through the cabin walls, desperate and alarming, causing all 3 family members to freeze mid-conversation. Brian later described the barking as frantic, almost human-like in its urgency, as if Pepper was trying to communicate something vital. Nathan moved toward the window to investigate the source of Pepper's distress, pressing his face against the cold glass to peer into the darkening forest. The barking continued for perhaps 30 seconds before stopping abruptly, with a sharp yelp that made Shanda's blood run cold. The sudden silence felt more ominous than the barking had been. Through the window, Nathan claimed he witnessed something that would haunt him for months afterward. A figure, significantly taller than the cabin's 6-foot doorframe, emerged from the tree line dragging Pepper by one hind leg. The creature moved with purpose rather than the random gait of a confused animal, heading directly toward the deeper forest with its prize. Nathan described the figure as massively built, covered in dark hair or fur, and moving upright like a person despite its enormous size. Brian grabbed his flashlight and rushed outside, following what he hoped would be a trail leading to his family's beloved pet. The beam of his light revealed disturbed ground and broken branches where something large had passed through, but no sign of Pepper. His calls echoed unanswered through the forest, and after 20 minutes of searching, he discovered a dark stain in the snow that made his stomach turn. The blood smear led toward a steep embankment covered in dense undergrowth, accompanied by footprints unlike anything Brian had encountered in his years of hunting. The impressions measured nearly 18 inches long and showed clear toe definition, far too large and human-like to belong to any known Colorado wildlife. The stride length between prints suggested a creature of enormous height and strength. When Brian returned to the cabin empty-handed, he found Shanda and Nathan huddled together, both visibly shaken by the evening's events. Nathan repeatedly insisted he had seen something drag Pepper away, describing details that seemed too specific for a frightened child's imagination. Shanda struggled to process what had happened, unable to accept that their family pet had simply vanished without a fight. The following morning, park rangers arrived to investigate the reported incident. They examined the evidence Brian had discovered, including the unusual footprints and the bloodstain, but concluded that a mountain lion had likely killed Pepper. The rangers explained that large cats occasionally ventured down from higher elevations, particularly during harsh winters when prey became scarce. Shanda found their explanation unconvincing, pointing out that Pepper weighed 70 pounds and had never backed down from confrontation with other animals. She argued that their dog would have fought viciously against any attacker, yet they found no signs of struggle beyond the initial bloodstain. The rangers acknowledged her concerns but maintained their assessment, suggesting that a skilled predator could subdue prey quickly under the right circumstances. The Jernigan family packed their belongings that afternoon and returned to Denver, their spring break vacation cut short by tragedy and unanswered questions. Nathan required counseling to deal with nightmares about the creature he claimed to have witnessed, while Brian and Shanda struggled to explain Pepper's disappearance to friends and family back home. Months later, Brian continued researching similar incidents in the Douglas Pass area, discovering a pattern of unexplained animal disappearances and strange sightings dating back decades. Local hunters shared stories of enormous footprints and glimpses of something that walked upright through the forest, though most preferred to keep such encounters to themselves rather than face ridicule from skeptical authorities. The cabin where the Jernigan family stayed was eventually abandoned by its owners, who cited maintenance costs and declining interest from renters. Some locals whispered that the real reason involved too many unsettling incidents and complaints from visitors, who reported strange sounds and sightings in the surrounding forest, though such claims remained unsubstantiated by official records. Yakushima Island, located off the southern coast of Kyushu, Japan, represented one of the country's most pristine wilderness areas in 2009. The island housed ancient cedar forests, some containing trees over 1,000 years old, creating a mystical landscape that inspired countless legends and folklore. The mountainous interior remained largely unexplored, with dense vegetation and unpredictable weather patterns deterring all but the most experienced hikers and researchers. Dr. Reina Kobayashi, a reclusive botanist who had retired from a long academic career, relocated to the island in search of solitude and rare plant specimens. Her small, solar-powered cabin nestled just inside the northern forest buffer zone, legally positioned for scientific residency. Reina's days were structured around detailed fieldwork, logging humidity gradients, tracking seed dispersal patterns, and tending to a terraced moss garden she cultivated as both art and experiment. Her routines were precise, bordering on ritualistic. Wake at dawn, hike to the ridge sites, log data, return before dusk to process findings. Her closest interactions were through radio check-ins with the Mainland Research Center every 3 days. She preferred the quiet, the isolation, the presence of ancient things that had never known names. On the evening of November 12, 2009, a severe cold front swept through Yakushima's peaks, bringing with it gale-force winds and needle-sharp rain. Reina secured her greenhouse panels and finalized her notes from a full day of ridge mapping. Just after dusk, she stepped outside to check a rain gauge positioned near the edge of the forest. She didn't hear anything at first, just the wind, But as she turned to go back inside, she didn't hear anything at first, just the wind. But as she turned to go back inside, she noticed a disturbance in the mud, massive prints in the soft ground, bipedal, wider than a human's, with an oddly organic asymmetry. Her headlamp flickered. Moments later, a rush of air passed through the clearing. Not a gust of wind, but a sensation of movement, as though something massive had passed nearby unseen. Early the next morning, Raina returned to the site with her survey gear. Clinging to a low-hanging branch was a clump of coarse, dark hair tangled around a splintered cedar twig, too thick for any known forest mammal on the island. She followed the tracks further and discovered a nest-like depression lined with stripped bark and forest moss, partially hidden beneath ferns. The prints had deepened overnight, pressed into frozen soil as though whatever made them had returned and stood in place for hours. Around the perimeter were indentations in the earth, not footprints, but depressions shaped like elongated ovals, as if heavy objects had been placed and removed. Raina filed a confidential report to the Forestry Bureau's Ecological Anomalies Division, omitting any images or specific coordinates. An official visited her cabin 5 days later, reviewed the findings in silence, and then, after asking to examine the physical hair sample only briefly before leaving without it, advised her to cease solo surveys near the shrine site. No formal follow-up was ever made. Other researchers on the island began quietly sharing their own unclassified encounters. A zoologist who heard bipedal movement paralleling him off-trail for over an hour. A field assistant who claimed to glimpse a shadowed, towering figure blurred in mid-step. Another who found stripped saplings stacked in teepee formations deep in a ravine. That winter, several of Raina's research plots were disrupted overnight, not destroyed, but rearranged. Sample containers were opened and resealed. Delicate moss beds were moved and replanted in intricate, symmetrical designs she hadn't created. At first, she assumed fellow researchers had interfered, but no one admitted to visiting her site. She had left a notebook open with a single question written inside, why someone was watching. And when she returned the next morning, she found a reply scribbled beneath it. The forest kept its own. Increasingly unsettled but equally fascinated, Raina installed basic perimeter markers made from natural twine and hanging chimes, avoiding digital equipment. One night, several of them were triggered between 2 o'clock and 2:15 a.m., their soft sounds overlapping in waves. At dawn, a long, low vocalization echoed from the northern ridge, a resonant, mournful howl that silenced every bird in the canopy. Hanging from the frame of the greenhouse door was a small woven talisman made from cedar bark and moss, tied with a delicate strand of her own survey tape. Raina continued her research for another year before accepting a visiting scholar post in Hokkaido. She never published her shrine findings, but archived them under a locked personal collection titled Threshold Studies. Years afterward, a team of graduate students cataloging non-vascular flora along the unmarked ridgelines of Yakushima stumbled upon a twisted cedar sapling tied with a strip of red cloth, beneath which was embedded a weather-worn tag, "Return what is not yours." They logged the location and moved on. None of their field journals included photos or samples, only descriptions. But one of the students, a primate behaviorist, later noted in her note that the scent in that grove was unlike anything she'd encountered in Japan, a pungent, musky trace closer to great apes than any native fauna. When their professor reviewed Raina's field map, archived without explanation in a drawer of Kyoto's herbarium, he noticed that the location matched a section she had labeled only with a symbol, a spiral inside a circle, ringed by dots. Raina never claimed she'd seen a creature, but she often told visitors that this forest doesn't forget who walks its edge, and it sometimes answers back. The Murrumbidgee region of New South Wales, Australia, encompassed vast stretches of eucalyptus forest and rugged bushland that remained largely untouched by human development in 1983. The area served as a popular destination for families seeking affordable camping experiences, with numerous isolated sites scattered throughout the dense woodlands. Ancient river red gums towered over smaller vegetation, creating a canopy so thick that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor during daylight hours. Hollow Pine Camp occupied a small clearing beside Jerobombera Creek, approximately 40 kilometers from the nearest town. The site featured basic amenities including pit toilets and fire rings, but campers were expected to bring their own water and supplies. Local authorities maintained the area sporadically, and visitors often went days without encountering another human being, making it an ideal retreat for families seeking genuine wilderness experiences. That winter, the camp hosted an unusual visitor, 24-year-old Raymond Keene, a postgraduate anthropology student from Canberra. He had come alone, seeking solitude and the chance to conduct a self-guided field study on Aboriginal rock art and isolated mythological motifs linked to the region. Raymond was experienced in bush navigation, well-equipped and methodical in his routine. He pitched his tent on the third site from the creek's edge and set about documenting tree markings and peculiar stone arrangements he found scattered deeper in the brush. By the second evening, he had cataloged more than a dozen distinct carvings, many of which appeared unnatural in shape and placement. He noted their symmetry and alignment with solar angles, something he hadn't expected in this part of the bush. On the night of July 19th, Raymond prepared a simple dinner by his fire and reviewed his notes beneath the glow of a lantern. Just after 10 p.m., he heard a sharp, metallic click, like two stones tapped together, from the trees east of his site. He paused, listening. It happened again, then silence. Curious but cautious, Raymond chalked it up to thermal contraction of the rock. But the following morning, he awoke to find his gear subtly rearranged. His compass was buried halfway in the sand by the creek. His boots were dry but facing the wrong direction. A string of seed pods had been tied neatly in a braid outside his tent, something he hadn't noticed the night before. Over the next 2 days, the phenomena escalated. His trail markers were altered, sometimes swapped with woven bark symbols. On the 5th day, he followed a set of shallow indentations, not quite footprints, leading him in a perfect circle through the trees. It was disorienting and left him visibly shaken. On the 6th night, Raymond heard a low, guttural sound, like a cough muffled by distance, followed by heavy rustling in the brush. This time he caught a glimpse, not a shadow or light distortion, but the silhouette of something large, upright, and breathing heavily as it stood beyond the firelight. It didn't approach, but it didn't leave either. It watched. At first light, Raymond found fresh prints nearby, not boot marks, but wide, 5-toed impressions, nearly twice the size of his own. Strands of coarse, reddish-brown hair were tangled in a low-hanging branch. The findings unsettled him more than anything else. He had expected solitude, not signs of an apex biped. Raymond packed his things and hiked out without finishing his study. He later submitted a vague incident report to his university's field safety office, citing environmental interference and cultural anomalies. He omitted the prints and hair from his official report, but kept them in a sealed envelope, later passed quietly to a zoology professor he trusted. Years later, Raymond became an expert in cross-cultural myth interpretation, often lecturing on symbolic landscapes and memory-linked geography. He never again visited the Murrumbidgee region, but once admitted over drinks at a conference that something there had watched him and chosen not to let him leave with answers. A decade after the encounter, one of Raymond's former students, intrigued by a passing reference in his lecture note, visited the same region to continue the unfinished field study. She too was academically prepared, but opted for low-tech tools, hand mapping, sketches, and direct observation, avoiding electronics out of a suspicion that the forest disrupted gear. Over several nights, she noted distant howls, long, mournful calls that echoed through the canopy, and always stopped before she could properly document. Once, she returned to her camp to find her journal open, a muddy fingerprint pressed across a page she hadn't yet written on. She never saw anything clearly, just movement, always at the edge of light. One morning, she found 3 small stones placed at the foot of her tent, identical in shape and arrangement to those used in one of the carvings she had studied. They hadn't been there the night before. By the end of her week-long expedition, she had collected no scientific samples, but filled dozens of pages with sketches, written impressions, and notations about symbolic behavior. What changed was her academic focus. From mythology to the possibility of undocumented fauna, an adaptive, nocturnal primate species exhibiting territorial behaviors. Her thesis was retitled Unclassified Hominid Behavioral Markers in Southeastern Australian Forests, and while its core idea remained controversial, it was never formally rejected. She submitted field notes and diagrams under restricted access for review, though no physical media was ever entered into university archives. On her final night, she observed a tall, broad figure standing motionless beyond the tree line. It remained visible only when the fire flickered, and it made no sound. She whispered a goodbye. She left a small offering at the base of one of the marked trees, 3 feathers tied with field tape, and whispered her thanks. When she returned 5 years later with a grant team, the clearing was gone. No carvings, no markers. Even the trail felt subtly realigned. Hollow Pine Camp remained open, but local officials began limiting stays near Jarrabombera Creek to short daytime visits, citing ecological fragility. Some locals spoke of watchers in the woods, not beasts, but something older. No pets vanished, no people went missing, but some campers reported that the forest seemed to move around them, that time stretched oddly, or that symbols appeared overnight. And those who stayed the longest described the same thing during their final nights, that they were being gently asked to go. To this day, no formal explanation has been offered for what Raymond or his student experienced. There is no evidence of a hoax, no photographic proof, just the quiet and persistent impression that something sentient, ancient, and unrecorded continues to watch from the trees, not to be solved, but to be respected. The Stara Planina Mountains formed a natural barrier between Bulgaria and Serbia in 1998, their ancient peaks shrouded in dense forests that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. This remote region housed some of Europe's last true wilderness areas, where brown bears, wolves, and lynx still roamed freely through thick stands of beech, oak, and birch trees. Local villages clung to traditional ways of life, with many families maintaining small homesteads that bordered directly on protected forest land. In one of the more secluded pockets of this region, an ecological research station operated under a joint Bulgarian-Serbian initiative aimed at studying predator behavior and forest health. The station consisted of 2 prefabricated buildings and a small observation tower set on the edge of what locals called Birch Hollow, a natural depression where white-barked trees created a distinctive grove. The team was comprised of 3 researchers: Dr. Elena Kolarov, a wildlife biologist, Stoyan Petrov, a field technician, and Lejla Mujic, a visiting graduate student from a university in Belgrade. The team lived and worked in near-complete isolation, relying on solar panels, shortwave radios, and weekly supply drops for communication and sustenance. Their days were spent tagging wildlife, tracking signs of animal movement by eye and plaster casts, and conducting routine surveys. Nights were typically filled with data analysis, equipment checks, and the occasional glass of homemade plum rakia. It was hard work, but the rhythm suited them. The forest was not just a workplace, but a companion, its moods and patterns familiar and, until that autumn, comforting. October 1998 brought an early frost to the Stara Planina region, prompting the team to focus on preparing their equipment for winter conditions. The observation tower needed reinforcing, and several animal trails required remarking before snowfall would obscure them. On October 15th, Elena and Stoyan were deep in the forest, examining claw marks on tree trunks and scat patterns near a wildlife corridor used by wolves and deer. Lejla remained at the station to sort through manual field sketches and prepare a report for their funding agency. The mist began to descend just after noon, earlier than usual, clinging low to the ground and growing thicker by the minute. Around mid-afternoon, the sky began to dim unexpectedly, not from cloud cover, but from a low-hanging mist that began creeping through the trees. At the station, Lejla paused her work, stepping outside to observe the phenomenon. The mist rolled in silently, unnaturally fast, swallowing visibility within minutes. Unease prickled her spine as the usual ambient sounds, bird calls, rustling leaves, fell away into a deafening quiet. Lejla noted in her field journal, "Silence like this doesn't belong in a forest." Meanwhile, as Elena and Stoyan made their way back, they encountered a disturbing scene. One of their animal tagging posts had been torn from the ground, not clawed or chewed, but snapped near its base with unnatural precision. Nearby, they found a ring of disturbed earth roughly 3 meters across, its center still warm to the touch despite the chilly air. Twigs had been arranged in a spiraled formation, as if intentionally laid. Rushing back toward the station, they noticed more oddities: moss and bark stripped from trees in vertical lines, and strange indentations in the forest floor. Not footprints exactly, but round impressions about a meter apart. They did not follow any trail, but zigzagged erratically through the underbrush. A strange metallic scent lingered in the air, something they couldn't quite place. Ozone mixed with something acrid and unnatural. When the pair finally reached the station just after sunset, they found Lejla missing. The front door stood open, with her notebook left behind on the table, pages fluttering in the breeze. Elena found her jacket still hanging on a hook, suggesting she had not intended to venture far. A fresh cup of tea sat untouched beside the radio. On Lejla's bunk lay a folded scarf and a partially packed bag, items no one preparing to leave suddenly would forget. They called for her for nearly an hour before Stoyan noticed a faint sound in the woods about 200 meters away, a deep exhale, followed by the sound of branches parting under great weight. They approached cautiously, expecting perhaps a bear, only to glimpse a figure, tall, covered in thick, dark hair. It stood upright beside a birch trunk, one hand resting on the bark, as if testing its strength. When they stepped closer, it disappeared into the trees with remarkable speed and silence. The following morning, they searched the area thoroughly. Near the edge of Birch Hollow, they found something unsettling. Lejla's scarf snagged on a birch branch, several meters off the ground. Beneath it, the same round impressions they'd seen earlier marked the soil. No signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks, just the scarf, the prints, and that haunting silence. Nearby trees bore twisting gouge marks, high up in the canopy, as if something large had moved through without using the ground. They reported Lejla's disappearance to authorities in Berkovica, who dispatched a search team. After 3 days of fruitless combing, the official conclusion was exposure or disorientation. But Elena and Stoyan remained unconvinced. The forest, once a familiar workplace, now felt watchful and alien. Wildlife sightings dropped dramatically, and even the wolves stopped howling. It was as though the forest itself had withdrawn. In the weeks that followed, their station was plagued by technical failures. Dry food caches were disturbed but not taken. Plaster casts left to dry vanished. Their woodpile was found rearranged one morning into a triangle pointing northeast. On 3 separate occasions, Elena awoke to find their equipment tent unzipped and ransacked, though nothing of value was taken. Their logs began to include unusual observations: temperature spikes, rhythmic knocking sounds in patterns too regular to be random, and nights when the surrounding woods went deathly quiet. The final straw came one night in November, when both researchers were awoken by an intense vibration in the ground, followed by a low, guttural cry unlike anything they had heard from known wildlife. In the aftermath, they found new markings etched into the trees, spirals and handprint-sized smears of dark resin 10 feet above the ground. The trees in the area appeared slightly wilted, as though they had been exposed to stress or disease. Elena documented the event obsessively, but could find no scientific explanation. Elena left the station the next morning, hiking out with only what she could carry. Stoyan remained for another 2 days before abandoning the outpost as well. The project was quietly shuttered, its records sealed under a confidentiality clause invoked by the Ministry of Environment. Their departure was never formally explained, and the site was absorbed back into the wilderness. Months after the station was vacated, a freelance journalist named Nikola Vidanov attempted to investigate the disappearance for an independent science magazine. He interviewed Elena, who refused to go on record, but shared some of her notes under the condition they not be published in full. What he read disturbed him deeply, especially the entries detailing the erratic behavior of animals in the days leading up to Lesla's vanishing. Flocks of birds had taken to circling the tower at dusk, silent and in tight, unnatural formations. A tagged lynx, normally elusive, had approached the station one night and stood motionless at the tree line, eyes fixed on the observation deck for nearly 20 minutes before retreating. Nicola hiked to Birch Hollow in early spring, when the snow had melted and the forest seemed alive again. He camped near the old station foundation, which had been dismantled but still bore signs of fire damage and corrosion, far more than should have occurred naturally in just a few seasons. On his second night, he experienced a brief blackout, waking to find his camp stove upturned and a string of hand-woven reeds tied in a figure 8 at the base of his tent. His notebook, however, remained untouched, except for a single unfamiliar entry in precise handwriting: "Don't forget what listens." Shaken, he left before dawn and never returned, later admitting in an interview that he felt observed in a way that had nothing to do with animals. In the years since, the area around Birch Hollow has been the subject of whispered warnings among local hunters and herders. Many refuse to enter that stretch of forest at all. A regional folklore revival group has begun to collect stories from surrounding villages, some of which bear eerie similarities to ancient Balkan legends of wild forest men, giants cloaked in fur, who emerge only when mist cloaks the trees and silence falls like a curtain. Whether myth or not, the Stara Planina wilderness has quietly reclaimed the hollow, erasing nearly every human trace. Yet something remains beneath the trees, something strong, aware, and closer to man than monster. In 2017, Black Ridge National Preserve, spanning a remote stretch of mountainous woodland near the border of Slovakia and the Czech Republic, remained a vast wilderness of over 700 square kilometers. Once a military training zone during the Cold War, its dense forests, secluded lakes, and jagged terrain had largely reverted to a wild state. Creatures long thought absent from the region had re-established their presence: lynx, wolves, even the occasional bear. And the park's isolation helped maintain its enigmatic charm. One of its most inaccessible areas surrounded Lake Marana, reachable only by unmarked trails and partially obscured by an abandoned concrete structure, a Cold War-era seismic listening post being steadily consumed by moss and trees. Instead of family members, the group consisted of 3 university acquaintances from Brno: Victor Havel, a 32-year-old acoustic ecologist; Teresa Mali, a 30-year-old cartographer creating 3-dimensional terrain models; and Lucas Sternad, a 35-year-old wildlife tracker and field artist. All 3 were drawn to the region not just by research, but by shared curiosity in remote landscapes and forgotten ecosystems. They arrived mid-September, when the forest's colors had begun to shift, and early frost made the ground brittle underfoot. Victor carried analog parabolic gear to study the acoustic behavior of regional wildlife. Teresa brought manual topographic tools, and Lucas planned to sketch and document any signs of megafauna activity. Their plan, a 4-day observational hike culminating in an overnight stay at the ruins near Lake Marana. The first day was smooth. Teresa mapped cliff edges and valleys. Victor noted odd fluctuations in ambient silence, gaps where natural background sounds seemed to pause. Lucas identified fresh scat and high tree markings indicative of territorial behavior from something large. They pitched camp in a dry clearing a few hundred meters uphill from the crumbling tower. The second day, a brittle mist settled over the trees early. While scouting the shoreline, Lucas discovered a series of tree breaks. Branches snapped at uniform height, well above human reach, and tufts of hair snagged in the bark. That afternoon, as the group lunched near the water, a deep vocalization echoed across the lake, a resonant, chesty bellow that silenced the forest. Victor described it as longer than a wolf call, shorter than a moan, like a breath turned into a warning. They froze, scanning the lake. Nothing moved. Teresa noted unusual trackways, bipedal impressions crossing a patch of mud near the lake, spaced too far apart for a human stride. The toes were visible, wide, bare, no claw marks. The trio backed away from the water. As they turned, A cascading sound, like dislodged rock, echoed from the tower ruins. Investigating, they found no one, but Lucas spotted something embedded high in the concrete. A sharpened stick driven several centimeters into the masonry, almost like a warning marker. None of them had climbed that high. Night brought little relief. They kept a fire going. Around 3 in the morning, a series of heavy, deliberate knocks echoed through the trees, 3 spaced out, then silence. That same hour, Victor awoke gasping, describing a pressure on his chest and the sound of breathing just outside the tent, deep and nasal, followed by the sound of something sniffing. Teresa confirmed she saw a dark shape moving uphill past the firelight, upright, broad-shouldered, and fast. By dawn, the forest felt altered. Birds were absent. The underbrush, previously dry, was saturated with dew, though there'd been no rainfall. Teresa suggested leaving immediately. As they packed, they discovered an arrangement of sticks and stones outside their tents. A spiral pattern, precise and clearly intentional. No one had left camp that night. They hiked back under a steady, unnatural hush. Along the way, they found more signs. A dugout mound filled with stripped bark and broken bones, and nearby a partial handprint on a boulder, 5 digits, thick, with no clear thumb separation. In the weeks that followed, Lucas became increasingly reclusive, sketching obsessively. Victor suffered persistent low-frequency ringing in his ears. Teresa's maps, once clear, now featured annotations about zones of soundless pressure, places she refused to revisit. They submitted a report to their university but were advised to revise findings for coherence. They didn't. None of them returned to Black Ridge. The seismic tower was later fenced off by government contractors, citing soil instability. No explanation was ever provided for the spiral patterns, the tree breaks, the vocalizations, or the unclassified prints. Lake Marana remains accessible by trail, but few venture close. Occasional campers report sensations of displacement, sounds with no direction, and time that feels misaligned, minutes dragging or vanishing entirely. And while the official record says nothing of missing persons, locals speak of hikers who enter the forest near the tower and are never seen again, only heard, in knock, in breaths, and in the echo of something still watching from the tree line. In 1972, a team of 3 Norwegian university researchers, botanist Ragnhild Nygaard, glaciologist Thomas Elvekrok, and linguistics graduate Håkon Brekke, set up a temporary field station near Lærdal in Sogn og Fjordane, Norway. The land was rugged, deep fjords, snow-covered peaks, and forests so thick they seemed impenetrable. Their rented cabin stood on the edge of the woods, originally an old herder's shelter, miles from the nearest village. Their research aimed to study behavioral patterns in alpine wildlife, particularly large mammals reported in local Sami folklore, such as the Storbjorn or Great Bear, descriptions of which bore an uncanny resemblance to modern Bigfoot accounts. Supplies were brought in weekly by snowmobile until December snowstorms made the path impassable. They had enough food, firewood, and a field-tested flare signal system with mirrored heliographs for emergency contact with their sponsoring research institute based in Bergen, until clouds blocked all signal returns on December 15th. On the afternoon of December 18th, Thomas was out measuring permafrost thaw depths, while Håkon sketched ridge topography for their movement mapping logs. Ragnhild was inside logging scat samples and hair fibers found around an unusually tall, scratch-marked pine trunk when a mirrored signal relay from their secondary outpost failed to return light. Thomas had earlier noted a faint, rhythmic knocking sound echoing up the valley, but found no wind or falling ice that could explain it. That evening, Thomas returned with a twisted metal fragment embedded in a fallen spruce, not part of any of their equipment. It was warm to the touch despite sub-zero temperatures. That night, Ragnhild's motion-activated perimeter sensor remained off, as instructed by protocol. But around 2:15 a.m., the cabin shook gently. No wind, no avalanche, just a single tremor, like a massive footstep had landed far off in the trees. The next morning, they investigated. They found scorched moss and circular burn marks in the snow, arranged in a tight grid. Ragnhild noticed that nearby lichen samples had blackened, as if flash-boiled, but the surrounding snow remained intact. Tomas, skeptical, suggested a rare chemical reaction from minerals in the soil, but Håkan noticed something else. On a natural wind funnel between two ridges, faint humming patterns echoed every 47 seconds. Unlike any bird call or echo, they mimicked a chant, tonal, slow, almost speaking. On December 21st, Ragnhild didn't return from her solo sample walk. She'd left just after dawn to follow fresh prints unlike any they had logged. Bare, five-toed, nearly 20 inches long, and spaced in a bipedal gait. Tomas and Håkan followed her path an hour later, after she missed check-in. They found her sample bag half buried in a patch of disturbed snow. Her notebook sat nearby, pages blank except for one scribbled phrase. The echo has shape, no blood, no tracks leading away. Only a smooth indentation in the snow, roughly oval in shape and faintly steaming. Tomas reached for his flare gun. It jammed, then sparked, then locked. They retreated to the cabin. For the next 36 hours, they heard intermittent clicking noises from the tree line. Not mechanical, but organic, like knuckle pops or jaw clicks. The temperature inside the cabin fluctuated despite a consistent fire. By Christmas, a snowmobile from their research institute finally reached them. Tomas and Håkan were airlifted out. The search for Ragnhild yielded nothing. However, Sami trackers called in for consultation reported that the marks and prints resembled old descriptions from winter migration sightings of the Isbjornvandrer, the ice bear walker, a creature neither bear nor man. Instead of burying the story, the institute filed a sealed field report. Tomas continued researching migratory anomalies and alpine primates. Håkan, increasingly drawn to patterns in the wilderness, focused his work on the rhythm and structure of sounds reported in remote mountain regions. Slow pulses, repeating hums, and tonal shifts passed down through local tradition. The cabin still stands. Occasionally, hikers or researchers attempting to reach it report strange equipment failures. Some say the wind carries words that don't match any language, and sometimes, only in winter, grid-shaped scorch marks appear briefly in the snow above Lærdal, steaming before fading as though they were never there.